Welcome to Second Earth Alternative, the channel where we go over the bizarre, the wondrous, some would even say unsettling truth that higher intelligences may be monitoring this planet as I speak. And if you're looking for the most accurate information on UAPs, aka UFOs, well, you've come to the right place. But you don't have to take my word for it. Time has actually been the main metric that has indicated this. What I mean by this is our track record. Many who have followed this channel for a long time, well, you know what I'm talking about. So just to give a quick update to the audience, I have been very busy lately. I was flown out to New Hampshire for a second time to shoot a video for Luke Rukowski of We Are Change. Now, if you don't know who Luke is, he's a regular guest at the Timcast IRL show. He was the producer of that very famous 9/11 documentary called Loose Change. And most recently, he's known as the dude who broke into Jeffrey Epstein's island, which was pretty awesome. Just as a side note, the guy is as nice as they come. He's an absolute pleasure to work with. And if you do want to check out the video that I ended up videotaping and editing for him, you can do so at www.learnfromluke.com. Okay, so in today's episode, I'm going to be going over an article that I actually never thought I would see coming. And the reason why I say this is because it's coming from space.com, who only tends to publish very scientifically based type of stories. So it's actually a breath of fresh air to finally see something on the topic of UFOs. And it's also about an individual, Leslie Kean, who we've been talking about lately. Now, in our last episode, we discussed her because she is an investigative journalist who has been on this topic for quite some time. But in only our second episode out of, 300 different videos that we've made, we ended up highlighting a story that she had written on Huffington Post, I believe it was May 2016, on an individual called Christopher Mellon. Now, Christopher Mellon is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for both the Clinton and the Bush administration. So he's a very credible, somebody who's worked for the government at an intelligence level. He also became one of the 4 founding members of To the Stars Academy, the group with Luis Elizondo, the guy who's working for the Aerial Threat Identification Program, that Pentagon-funded program on UFOs, who recently came out with all this information to the New York Times and all the other major publications regarding the Tic Tac UFOs and other videos that they've been releasing. One that actually was almost identical to the UFO that we talked about in our first episode, which was like their weird spherical object that just seemed to dart into the ocean. So starting off here at space.com, it says here, the new reality of UFOs, an interview with journalist Leslie Kean. The past few years have seen a big change in how UFOs are perceived, both by the public and by government officials. Leslie Kean is a veteran investigative reporter who has spent over 20 years delving into the once taboo topic of unidentified flying objects. UFOs are now established as real, she says. Furthermore, despite observations using highly advanced technologies, we have no idea what they are or where they come from. While Kean has never seen a UFO, her own close encounters with hundreds of government documents, aviation reports, radar data, and case studies with corroborating physical evidence, that's important because a lot of scientists don't claim that there's physical evidence out there, as well as interviews of dozens of high-level officials and aviation witnesses from around the world, have bolstered her belief that UFOs are worthy of scientific study. I believe we may have finally arrived at the threshold of a new paradigm, Kean said. Now, this statement is very interesting because she's not the first prominent individual who has actually hinged her beliefs on UFOs based on other people's accounts. Now, for me personally, yes, I have seen a UFO before, but somebody who never saw a UFO, but also was talking about it very confidently that this is a real phenomenon, well, it was former astronaut Edgar Mitchell. I mean, he's now departed, rest in peace, but he was somebody who had been very keen on this topic, no pun intended. He was very on top of this and was very adamant to say that not only are UFOs real, but that these are extraterrestrial intelligences, biological units, no different than you and I, but probably a lot more intelligent. Kean is author of the New York Times bestseller, UFOs, General Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record. Actually, this is the book I want to read. If anybody has read the book and you want to give us your take on it, please let us know in the comment section below. More recently, she co-authored eye-opening articles in the New York Times that focused on sightings of UFOs, which the U.S. military has recently rebranded as Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, and the government programs to investigate them. She also wrote UFOs Shifting the Narrative from Threat to Science, an article published on The Debrief earlier this month. And also, I highly recommend that article where she interviews Christopher Mellon, which was written on the Huffington Post. Space.com recently caught up with Kean to discuss what she thinks is in the offing concerning UFOs. What stands in the way of scientific communities taking on the challenge of discovering if any UFOs are extraterrestrial and more? So I guess Space.com ended up interviewing her. So they ask here, how do you best characterize where we are today given your New York Times co-authored piece that catapulted things into public view? Kean says, we have seen a major sea... Talking about, no pun intended, I don't know if she meant this, but they are asking here what she thinks is in the offing, which is the farthest part of the sea that you can see. And then she says, we have a major sea change since our December 2017 New York Times story that included 2 Navy videos. The government has acknowledged the reality of UFOs and the fact that they impact national security, and that alone is a major shift. We have more Navy videos of unexplained objects, an official UAP task force, and most recently, a government report on UAP, which was requested by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. The report stated, and this is something that we actually went over, I highly recommend the video, I'll leave it at the end of this video regarding the congressional report. But continuing here, it says, the report stated there is no evidence that UAP are ours, Russia or Chinese. It forced many stovepiped agencies to pull information for the first time and gain further attention for UAP from policymakers, with some calling for open congressional hearings. Even before the June 2021 UAP report, high-level officials have made statements as to the need for further investigation of these unexplained objects exhibiting technology beyond what we possess. The taboo against taking the subject seriously is diminishing, and scientists have come out of the woodwork advocating for studies on UAPs in Scientific American. This includes the highly skeptical Sam Harris. Now, Sam Harris is a guy who doesn't even believe in free will. I mean, he believes that consciousness is like almost like a factory, like an illusion created by natural cause and effect forces. But somebody who's that skeptical, who's now starting to accept the reality that UFOs are actually a real phenomenon that is way beyond our military capabilities, well, that's pretty significant when it comes to the culture of skeptics and scientific-minded individuals. These events are unprecedented, and the media can't get enough of UFOs. Recently, for the first time, UFOs were covered by The New Yorker in the CBS show, 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes did a recent episode on the topics of UAPs, UFOs, but there was also another 60 Minutes with war correspondent Laura Logan, who interviewed billionaire Bob Bigelow. Now, Bob is really significant because not is he a prominent billionaire, he's also one of the individuals who was taking in a lot of these reports from the FAA. And he was straight up telling her, not only are UFOs real, but they are extraterrestrials that are currently visiting this planet. That was a hell of an interview if you haven't caught it. Now, this is a great question because the implications behind the answers of this question really addresses a lot of the fallacies that have been spread by skeptics on the subject. And they ask, do you believe the UAP focus is the same as decades of UFO reports? Are they one and the same or not in your view? Kean responds, I don't think there's any difference in how the reports describe this phenomenon. Government documents such as the famous 1947 Twining Memo describes the behavior of the objects in the same way as later documents did, and in the same way they are reported today. The difference is that today we have better cameras, radar, satellite, and sensor technology than we had decades ago, increasing the specificity of data on UAP, which remains classified. The term UAP has gradually become the preferred term used by the governments and military because it encompasses a broader range of phenomena than the term UFO. And this is an important point because part of the reason what was keeping the spread of this information, at least from military individuals, and this is something that Leslie Kean actually addressed in her first article when she interviewed Christopher Mellon. Christopher Mellon did a really good job of describing how these programs are not only compartmentalized, but how these military officials are not coming out with this information because they're simply embarrassed by it. It all has to do with the stigma behind this phenomenon. So it makes sense that they decided to change the term to UAP. And part of the reason why I think this question is so important too is because it really addresses this skeptic hinge-pin, this thing that they've been holding on to, trying to believe that UFOs are not extraterrestrials, when they say, well, it could be Chinese technology, it may be some unidentified Russian technology that we have never encountered before. But if these are the exact reports that have been happening since the 1940s and the 1950s, perhaps even the Renaissance period, when you see UFOs in some of those paintings, if this is the exact same phenomenon, well, obviously they weren't building this type of technology back in the 1940s, let alone the Renaissance period. There really isn't much difference between the two other than the impression the acronyms create. One seems more cultural, the other more official. UAP removes any association with conspiracy theories or shows like The X-Files or The Fringe Element. Now, the fact that UFOs is quote-unquote a conspiracy theory, I think is a misnomer. Think about it. Conspiracy theory, a conspiracy is a criminal action that is being taken by two or more individuals. Now, the fact that the government kept this secrecy from the public, is that really a criminal action? Maybe that's partially based on interpretation, but I thought that it would have to be criminal for it to be a conspiracy. Thus, you can't really call the hiding of UFO information conspiracy theory or people trying to discover what this is. Just thought I should mention that because I'm kind of tired of this conspiracy theory label being used as this overall blanket to just kind of delegitimize anybody who talks about this topic. So just backtracking here, removes any association with conspiracy theories or shows like The X-Files or The Fringe Elements. Even so, the term UFO has been around forever and has a wider appeal. In my reporting, I use the term interchangeably depending on the context. And Space.com asks, given your long productive research on the UFO issue, what has surprised you the most? Similarly, what has disappointed you the most? Well, Kean responds, especially in the early years of my reporting, I was most surprised by the lack of curiosity among scientists and policymakers about UFOs. I was also surprised by how entrenched and powerful the stigma was in the media and in the culture in general. Yeah, when Dennis Kucinich, the presidential candidate, came out in that debate claiming that, yeah, he did see a UFO.
Now, did you see a UFO?
I did, and the rest of the account, I didn't. It was unidentified flying object. Okay, it's unidentified.
I mean, everybody was kind of laughing at him. It almost became a dart in his chances to be elected. It didn't take long for me to realize that most people in a position to make a difference were uninformed and understandably had other priorities. And this is a great point because these are just regular people who are just happen to be elected by other individuals. And, you know, when you talk about a politician, they're not particularly skilled at sciences, at least not most of them. These are people whose job is to serve their community, their cities, their states, but not necessarily to be the most scientific-minded individuals. You know, they're, like I said, just regular people who are elected by other people. But still, given how fascinated I was with this and given what it might mean, even if one UFO was extraterrestrial, I found this apathy and disinterest hard to understand. Many times I was amazed that accomplished investigative journalists did not jump on board and take deep dive into this subject. As a freelancer, I couldn't open the same doors at the Washington Post, the New York Times, or the New Yorker. Yet they were essentially silent. That was frustrating to me, but of course, it has all changed now. I was also frustrated that there was no government agency in place to receive reports from police officers, commercial pilots, and other credible witnesses, and to conduct investigations when necessary. And this is part of the reason why I brought up billionaire Bob Bigelow, because his position is not one of the government. He is literally a private industry who is taking in government reports from the FAA. It just goes to show you how little there was in terms of government agencies that were collecting this type of information. You can imagine my surprise when I learned about the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. However, being limited only to military cases and being secret, it was not exactly what I had been hoping for. Space.com asks, with all the chatter about UAPs and the UAP preliminary report, etc., where are we now and what's next? Now, this video is probably getting a little long, so I'm just going to skip to the very end to the segment of the paragraph that I think is more important. But it says here, there are videos and photographs in the Department of Defense files which are vastly superior to the ones we have seen so far. I think the public has a right to this and other data as stated by former U.S. Senator Harry Reid, who initiated the ATIP government program. The secrecy is excessive here, despite the need for some classification on grounds of national security. Perhaps we will be fortunate enough to see open congressional hearings on UAP, and eventually we may be issued a defensive statement that these objects are not Russian or Chinese. Now look how confident she says that. She's not saying that they may not be Russian or Chinese. She's saying that these objects are not Russian or Chinese. And another reason why I want to mention this article is because she's straight up saying that the Department of Defense has much better videos than we've been provided. And this is really important because there's been kind of a wave of skeptics who have been trying to disprove some of the footage that has come out from like David Fravor, the Tic Tac UFO. And to say that there are even better footage than these footages, which had sometimes radar association with them, they had both visual and thermal imaging associated with them, to say that there's even better evidence than that, that's pretty eye-opening. It kind of states that the proof is really out there. It has been established that they are not ours, but the door on UAP being technology from a foreign adversary has not been completely closed. Some in a position to know have stated that these objects are not created by Russia or China. That needs to be stated as fact in one of the subsequent written reports. Perhaps one day those two countries will join with the United States to acknowledge this reality. At that point, we will have crossed a line into a new world. And the congressional report was very adamant in saying that there's a lot of reports that are not only completely unexplained by any means possible of any type of physics that we understand, but a good percentage of them are also doubly confirmed with multiple devices. Let's say you get both a radar and thermal imaging for the exact same object, and it's also being visually noted by the pilots themselves. They ask, in my view, the public is experiencing a new wave of UFO frenzies, something I saw in the 1950s. There are charlatans in this arena hard at work to make money. There are dedicated investigators trying to unravel this saga. What are your thoughts on how the public should be wary but still remain open to getting to the bottom of the UFO story? I would advise the public to be careful about whom they listen to. Focus on official information. Yes, focus on official information provided by current and former government officials and others with credentials that are in position to have knowledge. I almost think that she's talking about Christopher Mellon, the government personnel who we talked about at the beginning of this episode, who she interviewed back in 2016. And actually, I've been following Christopher Mellon on Twitter, and I highly recommend, if you're really into this topic, to follow his tweets, because as she says here, they often speak in generalities because they have been exposed to so much classified information and can only go so far in what they can say publicly. But their words carry a lot of weight and should be taken seriously. I repeat, their words carry a lot of weight and should be taken seriously. In other words, yes, they're talking generalities, but try to decode what they're saying. They're often exposing information between the words. I recommend paying attention to the in-depth investigations, such as those from the debrief and the drive. In one tweet that I found really, really interesting, this was posted on July 7th. It's one of those generalities that he's kind of indicating that perhaps there is something to this that he knows more about. He says, we do not understand the propulsion systems of UAPs like the Tic Tac, but this website proposes one of the most thoughtful theories to date. And I read this, man. This is a long thing. I mean, it's really in depth. These guys basically discussed this really, really well thought out theory that's based on gravitational lensing. And so sometimes when we see UFOs, and UFOs are kind of looking as if they're like amoebas, or they seem to be almost like shape-shifting. Like you often see the term shape-shifting UFOs where they seem to be changing shapes. Well, they're talking about this as a form of gravity bending on itself. Because when you see gravitational lensing, you see patterns that are indicative of like this, for example, where you see 4 stars coming from a single star. So sometimes these objects seem to kind of do that. They kind of blip in and out in like this, almost like a four-cross corner. You see this effect with black holes. Like if you ever saw Interstellar and you see that giant black hole shape, well, that is actually a very accurate depiction of what the black hole looks like. And it's all based on gravitational lensing, that the force of gravity is so strong that it's literally pulling the image, the backside of the black hole, into the horizon. So that's why it looks like this L-shaped circle. And something else that I thought was really relevant with these explanations that they talk about here on UAPtheory.com, like I said, if you have time, I would highly recommend you reading this, is they talked about the idea that these crafts could potentially be thermodynamically isolating themselves in a gravity bubble. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Perhaps Bob Lazar, in his explanation of how UFOs are propelled. Bob Lazar, the man who apparently worked at S4, a site adjacent to Area 51, who claimed to back engineer flying saucers. That's the guy who Jeremy Corbell made a movie about, who has not changed his story in 30 years. I think Christopher Mellon is kind of hinting at something when he says that this is a very, very thoughtful explanation for UFO propulsion. Fortunately, this subject transcends politics, and we have to keep it that way. We must be wary of people with extreme conspiratorial views who are trying to influence the public for their own gain. Any such claims must be backed up with facts, names, and documents that can be corroborated, or they are worthless. I encourage people to bear this in mind when they come across what you describe as charlatans. Now, the reason why I said this channel is very accurate, well, for one, let me just note that we are completely demonetized by YouTube. So there's no agenda in trying to clickbait you to get the most amount of ad money that I can. I honestly, I'm like a no bullshit guy. Like I'll just say it straight up exactly how I feel about the subject. If I think it's fake, I'll say it. It's a fake. We try to provide documents when we can, like the document that we found from the CIA. But something that she doesn't mention that I do think is actually important, and I'm happy that I actually have a psychology background. I worked at the social psychology lab at UC Santa Barbara and partook in a lot of studies back then. I do think that psychology and the ability to take people's accounts is actually a form of evidence that should be looked into. So I would expand, in my personal opinion, her saying that it has to have corroboration and documents and so forth. I would encourage people to also take other people's accounts, but not just in the individual sense. Take, let's say, 100 accounts. Layer them on top of each other. When I say layer them, look at the similarities and look at the differences. Wherever you see the most amount of similarities, start dissecting what that could mean. Are these similarities due to cultural norms? Are these similarities unique? One study that was based on asking people to recall what it would be like to be abducted by aliens. And what was strange is that in actual cases of people claiming to be abducted by aliens, they overwhelmingly talk about some kind of medical procedure, especially related to something regarding the reproduction organs. Now, what's interesting is the study where people were asked to recall what it would be like to have an alien abduction. They hardly ever talked about that. So this is one example of similarities that you see in people's accounts that is normally not discussed when people actually try to make up these accounts out of random. The last question says here, do you expect full disclosure regarding UFOs in the near term? If so, is the public ready for this disclosure and the related add-ons of possibly distrusting the governments? It depends on what you mean by full disclosure. Some people think this means the government officials will stand up and announce that we have been visited by extraterrestrial crafts for over 7 years and we knew about it all along. I don't think this is ever going to happen. However, if we get to the point where it becomes an official, stated fact, universally accepted that these objects are not ours, Russian, Chinese, or made by any country on Earth, this would be disclosure of at least some UFOs originating off this planet. Some people talk about ultra-terrestrials, which means that perhaps these are intelligences that have been hiding. Let's say there is some kind of cavernous region under Earth. Maybe they were hiding for millions of years. Maybe there's a highly technological species that was here before that is flying around, whether it's from Antarctica or wherever, Some people even postulated that it's an artificial intelligence, like a robotic species, like drones that have been coming out from the center of Earth. Now, My personal take is that that is a more complicated, more difficult explanation than extraterrestrial itself, but I just wanted to note that off this planet is not the only theories out there regarding UAPs. At the same time, I suspect that tagged on to any admission along these lines would be the caveat that we don't know what they are, where they are from, or why they are here. Such clarity would not necessarily be established in the near term. I'm not sure about that either. Maybe it is. I mean, information is kind of coming out like an avalanche right now. It all goes in steps, sometimes small ones, and it takes time. I think the process will continue to be gradual disclosure, and this will help minimize distrust in government. It gives all of us time to absorb and explore and challenge each step along the way. We are closer than ever before to a new level of confirmation, yet I'm sure there's plenty of resistance to such a paradigm shift. There is another question. Sorry. Space.com. Lastly, is there a need to internalize this UAP UFO dialogue? Definitely. Sources have told me that other countries have reached out to us since the June UAP report was released. I didn't know about that. That's pretty cool. China has established its own UAP task force. South America is active in investigating UAP. International cooperation among government officials and among scientists is crucial in moving forward. And I believe that scientists need to follow the lead of Harvard's Avi Loeb. This guy is awesome. He's been talking about Oumuamua and how Oumuamua might actually be an extraterrestrial spacecraft, and he is a Harvard astronomer, and become more involved, initiating their own independent international exploration of this phenomenon. They might be able to tell us more about it than our government because they can make the results public. So there it is, ladies and gentlemen. I think that was a very informative article. I hope you took the analysis as just as informative as the article itself. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me. If you'd like to submit your own UFOs, please, I welcome you to do so. And just give me permission on the email that I can use the footage if that's what you want. But I encourage you to submit any footage at eafiles.contact@gmail.com. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Felipe speaking, signing out.